Today, students, in week 4, session 2, we look at Moses' call. Moses' call in Exodus 3 and 4, and then we'll continue the rest of the book of Exodus. Exodus, tremendous book, and it does teach straight historical events. We can't spiritualize those. Most of it is prose or historical narrative, and reads in a clear way. I mean, there is a clarity to the book, and the smoothness, as Dr. John Davis said, to the book of Exodus, to be called out. This is the book recording Israel's deliverance from Egypt after 400 years. And that prophesied, remember, in Genesis 15, 400 years of bondage. And there would be a deliverer by the name of Moses, the kind of prophet that would come along maybe once every 1,000 years or so, as Deuteronomy says. And there wasn't a man like him, to talk face to face with God and have such closeness to God. What a leader Moses was. But he was tutored by God. And I pointed out in this PowerPoint these 3 series of 40 years. Remember these 3 series of 40 years. 40 years Moses was in Egypt from his birth, being trained. And Stephen talks a lot about those 40 years in Acts 7 and how God trained him, a trained leader. All of that, that's not wasted. And that's something you should think about in your own life. God is training you and brings us through diversity sometimes we don't understand for purposes that only God knows that will transpire in our lives. It's hard for us to see. We can't see the future, but God knows the future. And just like God was honing Moses, maybe he's honing you for purposes. And Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness. That's quite a difference, quite a stark contrast from the luxury and the comforts of Egypt that he experienced. Now, as he goes to the desert and the rough area of his life, and God is training him there. It's kind of like Paul, saying, I have learned, whatever state I'm in, to be content, whether abased or having a lot or having nothing. I have learned in whatever state I am, Philippians 4, to be content. So Moses experienced the best of life and the hardness of life. And then he spent 40 years of that experience being the leader at 80 years old, being the leader of Egypt, leading them out of the land of their bondage toward the land of promise. So there was purpose in Moses' life, being 80 years old. Isn't that amazing? 80, I'm not 80 yet. I'm pretty close to it. But at 80, to start in that ministry, that primary ministry of his, to be the leader of that nation, and to lead the children of Israel through and hard times. And it wasn't pleasant to lead these maybe as many as 6 million 3 to 4 or 5 million people from Egypt to the promised land. He was 80 years old. He was called at Horeb to lead Israel out of Egypt. And that was done with God bringing 10 plagues upon that nation that we'll look at later. Those 10 plagues that culminated, remember, in the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians. As I pointed out, the Egyptian Pharaoh slew the firstborn of Israel, the Israelites. And now God will slay the one who gives life and takes life, the firstborn of the Egyptians. So we have the call of Moses, and this is a strategic event in Exodus 3 through 4. God is sovereign, but God does not override our will. He allows our will to take place in his sovereign plan. There are contingencies in God's plan. That's something that Dr. Albert J. McLean brought out strongly in his in his in his book on the kingdom, that there is a contingency in God's plan, always contingencies. For instance, Adam, don't eat this fruit. If you do, you will die. And he ate it. And so there were contingents. If you don't eat it, you will live forever. There was contingencies. When Christ came, offering himself to the king, to the Jews, they rejected him, but they had an opportunity to choose that. And if you hear the gospel, you have an opportunity to hear and to respond to the gospel, to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. So there are contingencies. Most will not come to Christ. As Jesus said, there's a narrow way and there's a broad way. Most will reject Christ, but many have heard the gospel and rejected it. But if they receive it, they are saved from God's wrath and born again and become his own possession. So here we have Moses. God is not going to override his will. There's going to be a choice to be made, and he's going to make the choice. I mean, God uses some convincing arguments in this call, but after experiencing, as I said in this PowerPoint, wealth and fame and training, he's now come through the desert experience training as a role and entered into the role of leader of these millions of people coming out of Egypt. Again, Stephen gives us some background of Moses' preparation in Acts chapter 7. And there's a section the writer of Hebrews gives us in 11:24 through 29 concerning Moses and his call. The call is at Horeb. That's familiar to us. It's the same mountain range that the law it will be given later on in Exodus 19, in that same mountain range. It is the mountain range Elijah goes to in 1 Kings 19:8. It's sometimes called the Jabal Musa, the Mount of Moses, over 7,000 feet. Now, God used as a attention getter a bush that didn't consume. It was burning, but it wasn't consumed. It's not something that rare, I guess, in the desert with the dryness there for plants to break out in flames, but this one was not consumed at all. God calls Moses out of this burning bush. What does that signify? Well, it's hard. Let me say this interpretive note here. When the Bible doesn't say what it is and why it is, then we really don't have a license to explicitly say this means this. We can make our observations. We could say, well, maybe it represents Israel that will not be consumed because God keeps his promises. Maybe it's the covenant of God. But if the Bible does not explicitly explain, that's just an interpretive note, then it's guesswork. It is basically guesswork. God does remind Moses here of the covenant that he promises to keep. And so that is a promise of an eternal promise God makes with Moses. And the name given here is the name of Yahweh. I am the Lord. I've given you a separate PowerPoint. I'll make it available. I've made it available online on the names of God. Lord is in all capital letters. It is that covenant-keeping God. I am that I am. I'm existing. And this is the way to look at it. I exist in order to perform. God expressed who he is, and he's living to do it. The gods of Egypt didn't exist. The God who called Moses was alive. I am that I am. He existed in order to perform what he had promised he was going to do. The performance of God, I say, is expressed in Exodus 3:16. El Shaddai, the provider, God will provide. God is alive, and he will enable Moses to be the leader, will give him the power to be the leader that he ought, will give him tremendous accompanying visual aids with those 10 plagues that he will demonstrate who he is to the Egyptian rulers and to Egypt. But of course, Pharaoh hardens his heart, and then God hardens his heart because he will not listen. Again, there are contingencies. I think God had cooperation from Pharaoh in hardening his heart, because Pharaoh hardened his heart also and would not accept God's salvation. I am that I am. It is the next basic name for God, translated Lord, and I have here over 5,300 times the self-existing one. This is not the first time it's used. The name Yahweh is used by Eve in Genesis 4:1, like I said here, in the days of Seth, chapter 4. Bethlehem, God revealed his significance name, the significance, though, of his name, as I point out, to Moses. He exists in order to do what he said he's going to do, while the other gods of Egypt did not exist. And by the way, those plagues would be targeted to the false gods, false Egyptian gods. This post-exilic times, it became so sacred it wasn't even pronounced. Adonai, as I point out here, was a substitute name. The vowels of Adonai were combined with the consonants, according to Charles Ryrie, of Yahweh, to remind the synagogue leaders of who this is. Jehovah became an artificial name. What does the Yahweh emphasize? It's God's, and this is in basic theology, I like what Ryrie said, it's God's personal name, his personal name to Israel. And it's also a covenant-keeping God. God's changes existence, his presence with his people, Exodus 12. And so God's power. So he exists, he is present, he's not going to leave them. Remember the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night to remind, in the wilderness, to remind Israel that he is there. He's ever present, is what the psalmist, ever present. And his power to deliver and his power to do, to perform, this is amazing, is his word. I've given you some compound names: Yahweh, I am who I am. Yahweh, compound names. This is based on Ryrie's. This is from Ryrie's Basic Theology. Excellent little theology textbook. Basic theology does emphasize the fact that he makes it simple, makes it clear. Some theology is not that simple, but he makes it as clear as possible, and as Ryrie does. Yahweh Jireh, the Lord will provide. Yahweh Nisi, the Lord is my Redeemer. Yahweh Shalom. And you know what names mean in the Bible? Names, this means God is actually what he says he is. Names means the person when it comes to God. A name means the person. This is what he actually does. He performs. He does these things. He is these things that he says he is. And so that's what a name is. It denotes, that's not always the case in our case. My name is Wayne. It means wagon maker. Wagon maker? I've never made a wagon in my life. George, first name, farmer. I was raised on a farm, but I'm not a farmer. But these names, when related to God, tell us who he is. They're important. And Yahweh is given the name to Moses. Remember, Jesus used in John 8:58, before Abraham was, what do you say? I am. And the religious leaders, hearing that, took up stones to kill him because they recognized what he was claiming. This is a clear claim of deity on the part of the Lord Jesus. No one can say that but God. So Jesus said, before Abraham was, this is pre-existence, I am. And so immediately the religious leaders who knew the scriptures recognized Jesus' claim to deity. It's called the sacred tetragrammaton. the I am. So Jesus makes that claim as to who he is in John 8:58, the sacred tetragrammaton. And so in order to demonstrate who he is, God sends these 10 plagues upon Israel. And I've listed them for you, and we don't have time to go through them. Actually happened to Israel, and was initially convincing, especially the last plague, that when the firstborn was taken. The purpose, as I say here, was to demonstrate who God is, a strong hand to this most powerful nation. And those plagues were discriminatory, not on Israel, but on Egypt. And so the theological implication of the last plague, when the firstborn was taken, the sovereignty of God, the superiority of God over all of these other gods, over Isis, to produce ISIS, supposedly to produce the offspring. The salvation of God in the Passover lamb, that's demonstrated in these plagues. Now, I won't have time to go through all of these events, the crossing of the Red Sea, demonstrating deliverance. God, and this is God actually is the creator, and he this is a miracle of timing. It's also a miracle when we see that the army of Egypt drowned. It's deep. This is not shallow water in this crossing of the Red Sea. Now, the law of Moses was given, in Exodus 19, and a strategic passage in 19, because it's Israel being constituted a nation, a kingdom of priests, and this is how Israel is constituted a nation. Albert J. McLean, who was the founding president of Grace Theological Seminary, which institution I attended, said this is the official beginning of the mediatorial kingdom of history. God ruling through humans on this planet. It was the kingdom of history, and it did have its faults because humans are sinners. But then there's a kingdom of prophecy introduced in the Old Testament, and that kingdom of prophecy is the kingdom that Jesus will rule over in the future. So Exodus is really the beginning of the mediatorial kingdom, not the millennial kingdom, the mediatorial kingdom, which God rules through men. He chooses on this earth a earthly kingdom, but then there's a kingdom coming that's going to be on this earth, but Jesus will be the head of that kingdom. And as Ryrie says, Exodus through Leviticus and the first 10 chapters of Numbers spell out this law of Moses, this law. And this law is a covenant, Mosaic covenant, with the Decalogue as the preamble to this covenant. But this covenant could not make the doer of the commands perfect, and we know that. It was given as a mirror to look into, to see that we are sinners, to demonstrate the fact that we are sinners, and so that to bring us to Christ, having demonstrated that we cannot do it. Actually, the law of Moses kept the obedient ones in the covenant, but did not promise salvation. And Christ's death is the end of the law. And also, as we look at the law, and I say here, never intended to provide salvation. Only be kept in the covenant, but never to provide salvation. The lambs, the goats, the bulls, the bullocks, the rams could never, their blood, you could spill it and spill it and spill it, could never cleanse from sin. It was a covering. The Hebrew word is kafar. It was the offerings were a covering until Christ would come and take away the sin penalty. Romans 10:4 tells us Christ's death is the end of the law, is to those who believe, the absolute end. So the law was like a tutor, a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. I went through the law of Moses, the Decalogue, the commandments. The first 4 relate to our relationship to God. 5 through 10 relationship with our fellow man. It's called a covenant in Exodus 34. Now, beginning in chapter 25, we look at the tabernacle, God's coloring book for salvation, how God promises us salvation. I'm going to skip over actually the rest of the material on the law. You look at that in your study notes. But I say that the wilderness tabernacle is like a picture book of our salvation, how to approach a holy God. And right away, we're faced with that brazen altar. A sacrifice must be made. The way is through the blood, always through the blood. This was an earthly representation of a heavenly tabernacle, pictures a heavenly approach to God, Hebrews 8:2 and 9:1. And so it was called a sanctuary, a tabernacle, a tent of meeting. It was a tent, a portable tent you could take up and move as they moved through the wilderness. Israel had sacred places. The church has no sacred place. We don't have sacred places. Our church buildings are not sacred places. Only Israel has sacred places and things. So the Holy of Holies was, in fact, a sacred place. This is a picture of really a VBS we did at our church in Lexington. And really, this is exciting VBS when you make the furniture, you do it according to the measurements in the Bible. We had wonderful women who would sew these garments and make us these uniforms. I was Aaron there, and we tried to be as close to the biblical description as possible so that the kids coming to a VBS, and I got this idea in a Moody Monthly ad or a Moody Monthly article when I was a pastor in Indiana. And we've been doing this in all the churches I've been a pastor in. And the church is amazing. The church comes together and works hard to present this visual aid so that the kids can see with their own eyes sort of what it might look like in those days in the wilderness. We had a fellowship shelter that was just about the right size, as you can see to my right, of the tabernacle, and we could make these things. The work was amazing. In every church I presented this, the activity increases. We had people who weren't members of the church would come and volunteer their services to build these things to make them as close as possible. A lot of canned paint and a lot of cardboard. This brazen altar was really wood, though. We had actually a coals there and a grill that you could see smoke coming out of it. So God's visual aid was the tabernacle, showing how to approach him. And the priesthood is given, the Aaronic priesthood is developed in the latter part of Exodus. So we see that priesthood that really is limited. These were men who died. And Jesus forever lives as our high priest. Their offering could never take away our sin. Christ offered himself as that lamb that takes away the sin of the world. And so that priesthood was faulty too, because of the sinful men that made up the priesthood. And they were human. They died. Jesus, the God-man, rose again and ever lives, as the writer of Hebrews says, to make intercession for us. So I want you to read, fill in the blank places that I've left and those areas I haven't covered as much as possible, and make yourself aware in an overview of the book of Exodus. Have a great week.